The morning sun cast long shadows across the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi as Admiral Kiichi Nagamo stood motionless, studying the endless Pacific horizon. It was June 3, 1942, and the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy cut through the waves toward a tiny coral atoll that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, reviewed his flight plans one final time. Around him, the combined fleet's 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, bristled with over 400 aircraft. The pride of the rising sun had never looked more invincible. The Americans will never expect. U.S. at Midway, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo remarked to his staff officers. The Japanese plan was audacious in its complexity. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north, while the main force would seize Midway Atoll, establishing a forward base that would threaten Hawaii itself. Below deck, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga made final preparations for what promised to be another glorious victory. The Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns from China to the Dutch East Indies, carried themselves with the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. Their Zero fighters remained unmatched in aerial combat, and their torpedo bombers had proven devastatingly effective against Allied shipping. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and mastermind of this new offensive, commanded the operation from his flagship Yamato, the world's largest battleship. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity: force the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and experience would crush them once and for all. The intelligence reports painted an encouraging picture. American naval strength in the Pacific had been crippled at Pearl Harbor, with only 2 or 3 aircraft carriers remaining operational. The Enterprise and Hornet were believed to be somewhere in the South Pacific, while the Yorktown had reportedly suffered severe damage in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. As the massive fleet advanced through the pre-dawn darkness, radio operators maintained strict silence. The element of surprise would be complete. Midway's small garrison of Marines and Navy personnel would awaken to find themselves facing the full might of the combined fleet. According to historical records from the United States Naval War College, the Japanese force comprised nearly 200 ships, including 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, and 65 destroyers, representing the largest naval operation in Pacific history to that point. What Admiral Nagamo and his officers could not know was that their coded communications had been intercepted and decoded by American cryptographers at Pearl Harbor. Station Hypo, under the brilliant leadership of Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25, revealing not only the target of the coming attack, but its timing and composition. The trap was already being set. 3 American aircraft carriers were racing toward Midway, their crews unaware that they were sailing toward the most crucial naval battle of the war. The fate of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire war, would be decided in the skies above a remote coral atoll that few Americans had ever heard of. As dawn approached on June 4th, the Japanese Armada prepared to launch its attack, confident that victory was assured. 3,000 miles away, in the basement of Pearl Harbor's administrative building, Commander Joseph Rochefort removed his red smoking jacket and rubbed his exhausted eyes. For weeks, his team of cryptographers had worked around the clock, piecing together fragments of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. The breakthrough had come when they confirmed that the target mentioned repeatedly in enemy communications was indeed Midway Atoll. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had made the most crucial decision of his career based on Rochefort's intelligence. Despite having only 3 operational aircraft carriers against Japan's 6, he would position his forces northwest of Midway and attempt to ambush the approaching enemy fleet, The aircraft carrier, Yorktown, limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th. Her flight deck scarred and hull damaged from the recent battle in the Coral Sea. Navy engineers estimated 3 months would be needed for proper repairs, but Nimitz gave them 72 hours. Working around the clock, shipyard workers performed what many considered a miracle, making the carrier battle-ready in time to join the Enterprise and Hornet. Captain Mark Mitcher of the Hornet addressed his pilots in the ready room as the task force steamed toward their destiny. "Gentlemen, we're outnumbered, but we have one advantage the Japanese don't know about. We know they're coming." The young aviators, many of whom had never seen combat, listened intently as their captain outlined the desperate nature of their mission. On the morning of June 4th, Midway's radar operators detected the incoming Japanese strike force while it was still 150 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marines and Navy personnel rushed to their battle stations. The first wave of Japanese attackers, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, consisted of 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima Cape bombers, 36 Aichival dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Major Floyd Parks, commanding Midway's fighter squadron, led 26 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters into the sky to intercept the approaching enemy. The Buffaloes, no match for the superior Japanese Zeros, were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, 15 American fighters had been shot down, with Parks himself among the casualties. The Japanese bombers found their targets, despite fierce anti-aircraft fire from the island's defenders. Fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and the power plant was severely damaged. However, the airfield remained operational, and many of Midway's aircraft had already launched to attack the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney led 16 Army Air Force B-17 Flying Fortress bombers in a high-altitude attack on the Japanese carriers. Despite dropping dozens of bombs, the nimble warships evaded damage through radical maneuvering. The Army pilots, trained for precision bombing of stationary targets, found it nearly impossible to hit fast-moving ships from 20,000 feet. As reports of the unsuccessful American counterattacks reached Admiral Nagamo aboard the Akagi, he faced a critical decision. Lieutenant Tominaga's radio message was clear: there is need for a second attack wave. However, Nagamo had retained half his aircraft to deal with any American naval forces that might appear. The Admiral's dilemma was compounded by contradictory intelligence reports. His search planes had not yet located the American fleet, leading him to believe that no major enemy naval forces were in the area. At 9:15 in the morning, Nagamo made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs instead of anti-ship torpedoes. Preparing for a second strike on Midway, historical documentation from the National Archives reveals that this decision would prove catastrophic, as American scout planes had already spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed its position to the waiting carrier task forces. Unknown to Nagamo, 3 American aircraft carriers were closing rapidly on his position, their flight decks packed with dive bombers and torpedo planes. The most decisive moment of the Pacific War was about to unfold. At 5:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the first American scout plane lifted off from the Enterprise, its pilot scanning the horizon for signs of the approaching Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Howard Young, leading Scouting Squadron 6, knew that finding the enemy carriers would determine whether America retained a foothold in the Pacific or faced complete defeat. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, made the bold decision to launch his aircraft while still at maximum range. The gamble was enormous. If his pilots failed to locate the Japanese fleet, they would run out of fuel over empty ocean. But if they succeeded, they might catch the enemy carriers while their aircraft were rearming and refueling on deck. The Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone, delayed by 30 minutes due to a faulty catapult, finally spotted the American task force at 7:28. The pilot's initial report mentioned only cruisers and destroyers, but a follow-up message sent Admiral Nagamo into a panic. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bearing 10 degrees. Distance 240 miles from Midway. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, recovering from appendicitis surgery and unable to fly, watched from the Akagi's bridge as chaos erupted on the flight deck below. Aircraft armed with land attack bombs had to be quickly rearmed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship warfare. Fuel lines snaked across the deck as mechanics worked frantically to prepare the strike force. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, knew his obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers faced almost certain death. The slow, vulnerable aircraft would have to approach the Japanese carriers at low altitude, running a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. As his 15 aircraft flew toward the enemy fleet, Waldron radioed his final message: attack immediately. The massacre of Torpedo Squadron 8 became one of the war's most tragic episodes. Japanese Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, dove on the American torpedo bombers with devastating effect. One by one, the Devastators crashed into the Pacific, their crews lost forever. Only Ensign George Gay survived. Floating in the ocean and witnessing the battle's climactic moments, similar fates befell the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers. The coordinated attack had failed completely, with not a single torpedo finding its target. However, the sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews served a crucial purpose. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, focused on destroying the low-flying torpedo planes, had been drawn down from high altitude. The carrier flight decks remained cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance as crews rushed to prepare the strike. Forced out at 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet. The Akagi and Kaga steamed below, their decks packed with aircraft. McCluskey pushed over in his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, beginning the attack that would change the course of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntless dive bombers from the Yorktown in a simultaneous attack on the carrier Soryu. The Japanese carriers, caught completely off guard with their fighters at low altitude, were defensively helpless. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, the next 6 minutes would be remembered as the miracle at Midway, the moment when American dive bombers achieved what many considered impossible against the most powerful naval force in the world, the fate of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. And with them, Japan's hopes for Pacific dominance hung in the balance as American bombs screamed toward their targets through the tropical sky. At exactly 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Dick Best pushed his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive toward the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi below him. The pride of the combined fleet steamed in a defensive circle, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being hastily prepared for launch. The first bomb struck the Akagi near her island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among parked aircraft. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly, sending pillars of orange flame skyward. A second bomb hit amidships, rupturing fuel lines and setting off a chain of secondary explosions that gutted the carrier's hangar deck. Admiral Nagamo, his white uniform singed by the blast, was forced to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara as flames consumed his flagship. The man who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor watched in stunned disbelief as his most powerful carriers were reduced to floating infernos in a matter of minutes. Simultaneously, the aircraft carrier Kaga came under attack from Enterprise dive bombers led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Best. 4 direct hits transformed Japan's second-largest carrier, into a blazing wreck. In the hangar bay, stored torpedoes began exploding, tearing massive holes in the hull. Captain Jizaku Okada, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered the Emperor's portrait removed to safety before giving the command to abandon ship, the Soryu. Admiral Yamaguchi's flagship suffered an equally devastating fate under the attack of Yorktown dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron scored 3 direct hits, igniting the carrier's fuel and ammunition stores. The explosion was so violent that it lifted aircraft off the deck and hurled them into the sea. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, commanding the Soryu, chose to go down with his ship in accordance with the ancient samurai code of honor. Despite pleas from his officers to abandon the burning carrier, he remained on the bridge, singing the Japanese national anthem as flames engulfed the superstructure. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 first-line aircraft carriers were burning. Wrecks, their experienced aircrews dead or struggling to survive in the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. The carefully planned Japanese offensive had been shattered by American dive bombers, who had achieved complete tactical surprise. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had helped design the Pearl Harbor attack, was among those. Rescued from the burning Akagi, as he floated in the water watching his carriers die, he realized that Japan had lost not just ships, but an entire generation of irreplaceable naval aviators. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterattack. 18 Aichi Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, set course for the American task force. Their target was the Yorktown, whose distinctive island superstructure made her easily identifiable. The attack on Yorktown came at 1:10 in the afternoon. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol fighters, 3 Japanese bombs found their target. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the lower decks, killing several men and starting fires. A second bomb destroyed the island structure, while a third hit penetrated to the 4th deck, causing severe structural damage. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his damage control teams into action, and within 2 hours, the Yorktown was steaming at 18 knots with her flight deck operational. The Japanese pilots who witnessed this remarkable recovery reported that they had sunk an American carrier, not knowing that their target had survived. A second Japanese strike from the Hiryu, consisting of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters, attacked the Yorktown at 2:45. 2 torpedoes struck the port side, causing severe flooding and a dangerous list. This time, Captain Buckmaster was forced to order abandon ship. However, Japan's brief moment of success was about to end. Scout planes from the Enterprise had located the Hiryu, and at 5 o'clock, 24 Dauntless dive bombers began their attack run on Japan's last operational carrier. As historical records from the Naval Historical Center document, the destruction of the Hiryu would complete one of the most decisive naval victories in American history, ending forever Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher adjusted his dive flaps as he led Enterprise Air Group 6 toward the smoking Japanese task force. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon on June 4th, and the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier, Hiryu, steamed alone through the debris field of her sister ships. Around her, destroyers and cruisers picked up survivors from the morning's catastrophe. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, knew his carrier was doomed the moment American scout planes appeared on the horizon. The veteran naval officer, considered one of Japan's most capable admirals, had already decided that he would share the fate of his ship rather than survive the disaster that had befallen the combined fleet. The 24 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise began their attack at 5:20. Flying in near-perfect formation, they pushed over into their characteristic 70-degree dives. their perforated dive brakes howling as they plummeted toward the unsuspecting carrier below. 4 direct hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck within minutes. The first bomb penetrated the forward elevator, exploding among parked aircraft and igniting aviation gasoline that spread across the hangar deck. A second bomb hit the island's superstructure, destroying the carrier's command center and communications equipment. Captain Tomio Kaku, commanding the Hiryu, was mortally wounded in the initial attack but remained conscious long enough to receive Admiral Yamaguchi's final orders. The 2 officers, knowing their ship was beyond saving, composed farewell messages to the Emperor and their families as fires raged around them. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who had previously bombed the Akagi, scored another direct hit on the Hiryu's stern, rupturing fuel tanks and starting fires that quickly spread throughout the aft sections of the ship. The carrier's fate was sealed when her own stored ordnance began exploding, tearing huge gaps in the flight deck and hull. As darkness fell over the Pacific, the 4 most powerful aircraft carriers in the Japanese Navy were either sunk or burning uncontrollably. The Kaga had already disappeared beneath the waves, taking down Captain Jizaku Okada and most of her crew. The Akagi and Soryu continued to burn throughout the night, their magazines periodically exploding in brilliant flashes that illuminated the oil-slicked waters. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, the hero of Pearl Harbor, found himself clinging to wreckage in the dark Pacific waters. The man who had led 400 aircraft against the American naval base just 6 months earlier now watched helplessly as Japan's naval aviation arm was destroyed in a single day. The human cost of the disaster was staggering. Japan lost not only 4 aircraft carriers, but also over 300 experienced pilots and aircrew members who could never be replaced. Many of these men were veterans of the China conflict and the early Pacific campaigns, representing years of training and combat experience. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, received the devastating reports throughout the afternoon. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his grand strategy had failed catastrophically. The decisive battle he had sought had indeed occurred, but the Americans had emerged victorious. At 8 o'clock that evening, Yamamoto made the painful decision to cancel the Midway operation and order a general withdrawal. The massive invasion fleet, including 11 battleships and dozens of transport ships carrying 5,000 troops, began retiring westward without having fired a shot at enemy surface vessels. The Hiryu finally succumbed to her wounds at 9:10 the following morning, June 5th. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku chose to go down with their ship, standing at attention on the bridge as the carrier rolled over and sank. Their sacrifice epitomized the code of Bushido, but it could not disguise the magnitude of Japan's defeat. According to documentation from the Japanese Defense Agency's War History series, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific, as the nation could never again mount a major offensive operation with the same strength it had possessed before June 4th. 1940-2. The rising sun's dominance of the Pacific had ended in the space of 6 minutes, and the tide of war had turned irreversibly in favor of the United States. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, the Pacific Ocean around Midway Atoll was littered with the debris of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and the hopes of an empire. Oil slicks stretched for miles across the calm waters, while American destroyers and submarines searched for survivors and intelligence materials from the sunken vessels. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, surveyed the scene of devastation as he flew combat air patrol over the American task force. The veteran pilot, who had developed innovative fighter tactics that would later bear his name, realized he was witnessing a turning point that would reshape the entire Pacific War. The damaged carrier Yorktown abandoned the previous afternoon. After taking 2 torpedo hits, remained afloat despite predictions that she would sink within hours. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, who had reluctantly ordered his crew to abandon ship, watched from a nearby destroyer as salvage parties prepared to reboard the listing carrier and attempt to save her. At 6:10 in the morning, the Japanese submarine 168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahashi Tanabe, spotted the crippled American carrier. The submarine had been searching for targets since the previous day. Unaware of the catastrophic defeat suffered by the combined fleet, Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes at the Yorktown from a range of 1,200 yards. 3 missed their target, but the 4th struck the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside the carrier providing power and pumping services. The Hammond broke in 2 and sank within 4 minutes, taking 81 of her crew to their deaths. The torpedo explosion also caused fatal damage to the Yorktown's hull. The carrier, which had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and 2 separate attacks at Midway, finally succumbed at 5:05 the following morning, June 7th. As she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, the last major American casualty of the battle was claimed by the sea. Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring the battle from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, understood the strategic implications of the victory even as reports continued to arrive. The Japanese combined fleet, which had appeared invincible since Pearl Harbor, had been dealt a blow from which it would never recover. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was devastating. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster by his naval staff, maintained his customary composure but privately understood that Japan's chances of achieving a decisive victory had vanished with the 4 carriers. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the failed Midway operation, fell into a deep depression following the defeat. The man who had warned his government that Japan could only maintain the initiative for 6 months had been proven tragically correct. The loss of experienced aircrew proved even more critical than the destruction of the carriers themselves. Japan's naval aviation training program, already strained by rapid expansion, could not replace the veteran pilots lost at Midway. Future Japanese air operations would be conducted by increasingly inexperienced crews. Against growing American air superiority, American industrial capacity, already beginning to eclipse Japanese production, would now operate without the threat of major enemy naval interference. The Essex-class aircraft carriers rolling off, American shipyards would face no serious challenge from the depleted Japanese fleet. According to strategic analyses conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey after the war, the Battle of Midway marked the point at which Japanese defeat became inevitable. Though the war would continue for 3 more years, intelligence reports reaching Tokyo painted a grim picture of American capabilities. The fact that the U.S. Navy had positioned its forces perfectly for the ambush suggested that Japanese codes had been compromised. Though the full extent of American cryptographic success remained unknown to enemy commanders, the 6 months of Japanese expansion across the Pacific had ended abruptly in the skies, above a tiny coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of before June 4, 1940. 3 months after the Battle of Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the long march toward Tokyo that would end only with Japan's surrender in 1945. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the United States, and the Pacific War had entered its decisive phase. Admiral William Bull Halsey, who had missed the Midway battle due to a skin condition, returned to command American carrier forces in the Solomon Islands campaign. The aggressive admiral would lead these same pilots and ships in a series of increasingly successful operations that pushed Japanese forces steadily westward. The surviving Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Suikaku, would never again operate with the effectiveness they had shown in the war's early months. Chronic shortages of experienced pilots, combined with declining fuel supplies and increasingly aggressive American air attacks, reduced them to defensive roles in which they could only delay the inevitable. Captain Matsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor attack leader who had survived the sinking of the Akagi, spent months recovering from his injuries in a Japanese hospital. The man who had once led 400 aircraft against the American fleet would never again command a major air operation, as Japan lacked both the planes and pilots for such missions. Lieutenant Dick Best, whose dive bombing had helped destroy 2 Japanese carriers in a single day, returned to the United States as one of America's most decorated naval aviators. His precise attacks on the Akagi and Hiryu had contributed directly to the victory that changed the course of the Pacific War. The intelligence triumph that had made the American victory possible remained classified for decades after the war. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptographers at Pearl Harbor received little public recognition during the conflict, though their work had arguably saved the Pacific Fleet from destruction. Japan's attempt to establish a defensive perimeter extending from the Aleutian Islands to Australia had collapsed with the loss of its primary striking force. The combined fleet, once the most powerful naval formation in the world, would spend the remainder of the war in increasingly desperate defensive battles. The technological balance began shifting in America's favor as new aircraft like the Grumman, Hellcat fighter and Curtiss Helldiver dive bomber entered service. These aircraft, superior to their Japanese counterparts, would dominate Pacific skies for the remainder of the conflict. Training programs that had produced the veteran Japanese pilots lost at Midway could not be replicated under wartime conditions. American flight training, conducted in the safety of the continental United States, steadily improved in both quality and quantity as the war progressed. The strategic implications of the Midway victory extended beyond the Pacific theater. With Japan's naval power broken, American forces could be deployed to other theaters, contributing to the eventual Allied victories in North Africa and Europe. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the battle years later, attributed the victory to the fendu courage of American pilots and the invaluable intelligence provided by the codebreakers. The combination of tactical surprise and individual heroism had overcome seemingly impossible odds. As documented in the official Navy history, the Battle of Midway demonstrated that industrial capacity and technological innovation could triumph over initial military advantages when combined with superior intelligence and tactical execution. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese expansion across the Pacific began its long descent toward defeat on June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers proved that even the most powerful naval force could be destroyed by determined pilots flying obsolete aircraft. The 6 minutes that destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers had indeed changed the course of history, ensuring that democracy would survive the greatest challenge it had yet faced in the modern era.